Hey, Terrasaur here with a video on how to shot call effectively, and I promised I would do something like this because I feel like this is one of those qualities that's hard to come across in a League of Legends player just because of the way the game is and how Riot didn't implement a voice a voiceover that you can communicate with your team with, and also how when people are playing League of Legends and MOBAs in general, the ping system is kind of effective, but usually people are more focused on their actual character and are really focused on themselves and don't really consider it a team game. And when looking at it in a ranked perspective, it's all about me, it's all about I. And I just felt like if more people were to step up into the leadership position, that people would be willing to follow you. I guess it also comes with the community and how the League of Legends community is toxic, but that's for another kind of discussion. But I just feel like people should step up and be the ones to either take the blame or take all the glory for making team decisions. And to kind of distill shot calling and define it, in my personal opinion, is taking information presented to you on a map, which is important in a game with fog of war, so you don't get the whole picture 100% of the time. You have to make decisions based off of what you know, and it's telling your team to make that decision. Yes, you can be a good shot caller and still lose the game. That's not the point. This point is to kind of, I guess, get better at shot calling for ranked 5 purposes and for solo queue purposes, and also about losing the game with shot calling. Like, you can make the perfect calls, you can do everything in your power to lead your team, but it doesn't matter if the horse doesn't want to drink the water. So you can say, let's get dragon, guys, it's important, we need this to secure the win, but it won't really matter if your Vayne is sitting bot farming, and that would kind of discourage people from calling shots. But the only way to get better at something is by practicing it, and it might be literally like pulling hair out in solo queue to try and shot call effectively. But to get better at this for ranked 5s, or if you're looking to go pro or whatever, or even if you just want to have more enjoyable games because you're a natural leader, you have to practice it in solo queue, even normal games, but normal games usually aren't taken seriously. So as we get into the actual video, just some general tips is to always be nice and diplomatic, because I'm even guilty of this in going to solo queue and just becoming super frustrated with my team. Like, I want to recommend having a song or just something like maybe a stress ball that you can get rid of like all your stressor to realize like, okay, I need to calm down, I need to make the best calls, because your mood highly affects how you're going to call. If you're feeding in game and you're looking to make calls, like, it might put you on tilt, like, oh man, we can't take this dragon because I'm behind. You need to take yourself out of the equation and look at your entire team and say, I might be behind because I fed 5 kills in lane, but my bot lane is super ahead, so that we can force these objectives, or that we can get deep wards in the enemy jungle. And every once in a while you always come across a player who's like, no, I'm not going to listen, I'm just going to split push, whether it's that Nidalee or whether it's that Vayne, and then the best you can do is honestly just alter your calls around it. So if that Nidalee wants to split push top, tell your team to group middle and get deep wards in the top side jungle, so that when the enemy team does rotate top, your Nidalee has vision, or you can rotate into the enemy jungle, the top side of the enemy jungle, and get picks off so that you can win the game. And then Nidalee still gets the glory that, oh, I split push and carried, and you still get the glory that you made the shot calls and that you still get the elo or whatever. Second of all, make sure you're comfortable on your champion. I like to think shot calling is most effective when you're from the support or the jungle position, because they're not necessarily mechanically intensive, and also mid lane works too, because you just clear waves one after another, and you can look at the map. And mid lane and jungle put a lot of pressure on the map and help control the pace of the game, but the support role, you're not necessarily doing much at certain times, and also you can roam once you're into the higher levels of play and into rank 5s. So you have to be comfortable on your champion, because shot calling takes a hit on your mechanical skill, and you can't constantly be looking at your lane, or you can't constantly be looking to time your cooldowns at like peak 100%, because you have to be focusing on the team, you have to be focusing on where the jungle is, you have to be focusing on telling your team where the jungle pressure might be, and you have to be focusing on calling things like teleports, cooldowns, timers, where to ward, where the enemy jungler is going to be, and where to force objectives. Third of all, I kind of touched on this earlier, but it's to make calls for the team and not yourself. So let's say you're Corky and you're playing with the Sona, like I'm gonna show in a next screenshot, and you completely dumpster the enemy lane. It's a Kog'Maw and something like a Janna. So they picked a passive lane to try and scale into the late game, and you picked a very super aggressive early game lane, and you completely shut them out. So you're ahead in lane. What do you do at this situation? The correct call, in my opinion, would not to be for you as the Corky to go bot lane and continue to push that lane. Even though the Kog'Maw might freeze the lane and have a chance to get back into the game, what you want to do is you want to group middle with the rest of your team and start forcing objectives like turrets or pushing the waves middle, force the enemy team to clear the waves and get deep wards in the enemy bot side jungle, like the red part or blue part, depending on which side you're on, but the bot side jungle, because you know that part is behind. So you want to make plays where the enemy might be freezing, so they're forced to either give up waves to their turret, or they're forced to help defend objectives like dragon or their blue or red buffs, or they're forced to take a team fight in the jungle, which they're behind in because you're the Corky and you're ahead. So it's kind of making calls that you might have to give up farm, and your farm might not look as impressive because you gave up farm to go push with your team, or the enemy Kog'Maw might even catch up and be ahead of you on farm, and they might have 300 CS while you have 200, but it comes out to game impact, and what did you do with your lead that was so much more effective than the Kog'Maw trying to come back up into the game. Fourth of all, yeah, it's the fourth point, is if you don't like the calls, follow them and then either make your own or be quiet. So as a shot caller, you're not going to have the best calls 100% of the time. Sometimes you're going to mess up, and it's going to lead to your team either losing or getting far behind or throwing your lead. And the best thing to do in this situation is just to continue to make calls until someone on your team points out that your calls aren't working. Then you position them, okay, fine, my calls aren't working, you make the calls yourself. What do we do in this situation? You ask the person yourself. If the enemy, if your teammate's going to be like, oh, I don't know, Mr. Shot Caller, what do we do? And start being smart ass and sarcastic like that, that game is already lost because that person wasn't receptive in the first place. And you have to accept that. And then the best thing to do in that situation is just to go back and look at where you make the wrong shot calls. And for those kind of things, it's good to really record your games on something like an LL replay, or even to have OBS open so that it comes with the voice comms and you can hear it and you could kind of pinpoint, oh, I didn't realize that the enemy had a ward at this position and actually saw us and stuff like that. So that's that kind of thing. Fifth of all is always carry wards, because as a shot caller you want the most information that you can get. Pink wards and green wards are really, really good. As a mid lane and as a jungle and as a support you should be warding anyways, and if you're not warding as a support, that game is lost. If you're a jungle and mid lane, at your second or third back you should have either a blue trinket or a red trinket to get vision and to deny vision. And you should constantly be buying wards. The only time I would recommend is getting the trinket on the second back as if you're playing something like Rise and you're getting like wrecked in lane and you need that trinket to prevent yourself from being dove, and you're constantly spending your extra 100 gold on potions, then yeah, I don't recommend getting a sweeper. Or if you're a split pusher like Nidalee, I recommend staying on your yellow trinket and just buying wards, because it's more helpful and beneficial to the team. And also upgrading your trinket, because getting that sweeper, the Oracle's lens, is super good, especially if you're a support. You should get that immediately after you're level 9 if you have the gold, or if you're like a jungler, like that should be one of your utmost priorities, and that will help you like snowball your team. And in solo queue, like, I know most people were like, no, I want to carry the team, so instead of upgrading my my trinket, I'm going to spend that 475 gold on getting something like an extra longsword and some potions. And that's just as good if you're super ahead and whatever. But this is for shot calling, and if you're looking for a video on how to put the entire team on your back, this is the video for you. Almost the final point is constantly be communicating, constantly be typing to your team, constantly be telling them my cooldowns are this, when are your cooldowns, because sometimes some people will realize, oh, the Sona's saying that her ultimate is in 60 seconds, I better say when my ultimate is, so that we can coordinate the AoE wombo combo or sometimes you're gonna have to pull it out of them and like, when's your ultimate Malphite or when's your ultimate Orianna, and they'll tell you, and then if it's 60 seconds or whatever, or if they say in a minute, just do the quick math, and then you should come up with the optimal way when you should engage. It should never be that you as Sona flash ultimate the enemy team and get all 5, and then you're looking at your team and you're like, guys, why aren't you coming? Because you didn't know that they didn't have ultimates. And another way to do it is just look at the green dots. I'm pretty sure those aren't bugged anymore. And if someone's like, oh, my ultimate's bug, then I guess that's an excuse, but that usually doesn't happen unless the champion's new. And the last point is, some games are just unwinnable. Some games you're just going to have people who are unresponsive. Some games you're just going to have AFKs. Usually when you're shot calling, people listen to you if you're nice, and if you are actually part of a lot of the kills. Like if you're a jungler and you happen to camp the mid lane because that was the lane that's going to get you the most kills, and you saw it, and you're generally going to be on the mid lane's good side if you gave them blue buffs, and you're like 0, and like 10, and you didn't take their farm, you didn't tax their lane hard, and the mid lane has blue buffs, the mid lane's 10 and 0, the mid lane's going to be on your side. He's going to be like, yeah, we should listen to this Lee Sin, like, let's do it. And if you're like 10 and 0 in lane, like as Renekton, because you just completely pooped all over your laner, your team's going to be like, yeah, we should listen to this Renekton. This Renekton's doing very well. So some games are just unwinnable in the sense that some people are just unresponsive. They're not going to listen, and like if they aren't carrying the game, then the game is lost for them. So we'll get to things to consider. These are the points, I guess, the general points that you as a shot caller should take in for information. Obviously there's sub points and there's stuff like that, but I feel like these were the pillars of information that you should constantly be aware of, and win conditions relies on all of this. So you have your champ select, your team composition, how did that go? Are people arguing during draft phase? Did your draft phase work out? Your level 1s, can you actually make a level 1, or should you just set up the line of scrimmage, as LCS casters like to call it, and just put wards up so that you don't get collapse upon and you don't get 3 buffed or you don't get invaded? Then it's the early game. Is your team composition suited for early game? Are you going to fall behind in the early game? Do you have to give up the early dragon at like 8 or 10 minutes? Mid game, can you guys actually siege, or did you guys fall so far behind in the early game that you need to just defend turrets, or are you guys that far behind that they can dive you under turrets? Like, what do you do to come back? Late game is, are we on par with the enemy team, or are we still trying to catch up? Do we need to stall out this game? Can we stall out the game? Do we have wave clear? If you have a Vayne, Sona, Udyr, Nidalee, and something like a Yasuo, you're not going to be clearing waves effectively or in a timely manner to be able to stall out the game. So sometimes just stalling out is not going to be well, and you're going to need to split push, or you're going to need to go for a pick. And lastly, objective control. Do we have the proper wards to take this objective, and do we have the proper team comp? Because sometimes as a Warwick and Jack's team comp, like, you can just dual Baron, whereas if you're something like Xerath and what's a pokey top laner champion, I guess AP Nidalee, if you play it safe, actually did play it, so it's still viable. If you're something like a Xerath and Nidalee, you kind of want to wait for the enemy team to do the objective first and poke them out of it before you do the objective yourself, because your poke, like, you need the enemy team to be grouped up in a certain area, and the best way to do that is to let them start the Baron, let them start the Dragon. And Baron does give magic resistance reduction, so it makes your poke hit that much harder. Excuse me while I take a drink. So over here is an example of the champ select screen, and this is actually from one of my solo queue games. It was ranked, it was at the D4, D3, D5 level. Those are the elos, or the people ranging into it. And also, I think someone was duo in this, so we might have had some plat 1s, plat 3s, I don't know. But that's the elo bracket I'm in. You can see the picks and you can see the bans. I just banned Justana, Maokai, Morgana because those are annoying. Whatever. I took support because, I don't know, I'm a support main. I can play top, I can play jungle, but that's besides the point. I usually play those roles because it's easy to shot call from. And you could just see the champ select, how it went. My room page, mastery page, that's not important, but what's important over here is team composition. Now, if you look at our team composition, we have certain champions that people would say are underpowered for solo queue, but I believe in solo queue can win with anything, and the enemy team has a pretty decent team composition with power picks like Kog'Maw, Vi, and Ziggs, and you would you could argue that Gnar and Malphite are weak picks. And when you're going into team compositions, the first thing you want to look at is what is our team good at. So I looked at what is our team good at, and it's kind of I want to say our team is decent at sieges if we give Corki blue buffs, but that's usually not going to happen. But our team does have very, very good lockdown between Viger's CC, Rammus's taunt, and my stun. We have a good lockdown, but to waste all those would be kind of a detriment. We also have decent wave clear with Corki, and we have the ability to split push. Now this is very important because split push often wins games in solo queue, but it's very hard to coordinate that. So when you're in solo queue, we have the ability to split push with this Quinn compared to Malphite, because Malphite's gonna have to be chain clearing waves, and Malphite's gonna have to teleport in to come in and initiate team fights, because he's part of the initial initiation, unless Vi's going to initiate, and that shouldn't happen. And we also have a good counter engage between the Sona ultimate and between Viger's stun, so it's just weighing out the pros and the cons of the team comps and where people are going to lane. Because if you actually look at this team comp, what most people think is going to happen is you have mid Ziggs, you have Vi jungle, you have Malphite in the top lane, or you have Malphite support because they chose Gnar as last pick, so he must be a counter pick to this Quinn. You have Gnar in the top lane, you have Malphite support, which is semi-viable, and you have Kog'Maw. So that's what most people would think, and that's what you have to plan for accordingly. They actually ended up throwing up a wrench in my plans, and Malphite ended up going top, and Quinn got rocked. And we were actually ahead bottom lane because they chose Gnar, which wasn't really effective support, and I just healed up the poke, and Corki and I dominated that lane. And the enemy team, my team actually wasn't responsive to the shot calls. Like I said, every game is not winnable. We were actually 15-0 at some point. It was ridiculous. The Rammus was very good, but the Quinn just kept running into the enemy team because she thought the game was over at 20 minutes because we were up 20-0 or something ridiculous. And Viger kept getting caught out in the jungle because he was 5-0 and he thought he could kill anyone, but the jungle was warded. So that was just something. Team composition, I went through most of this. You can read this on your own, you can pause the video, whatever, I don't care. But it's just looking at power spikes. So if we were to take an example from the previous game, power spikes at certain levels. So Vi, Ziggs, and Malphite arguably are weak until they hit that level 6. At level 6, Malphite, Vi, and Ziggs all have access to super good ultimates, whereas if you're looking at Corki's rockets are good, but it's not something as huge as a Malphite ultimate, as something as a Vi ultimate. When you also look at Corki, item power spikes, item thresholds, these things are important because when Corki gets Trinity Force, Corki is strong. Corki ended up getting his Trinity very early into the game, and when Corki is strong, he should either look to 1v1 in the bot lane, or to group up with his team and start sieging turrets and start poking. And that's what we did. So, second of all, how will the lane matchups work? Who will shove first, or who has the stronger early game? If you have something like a Renekton on your team, you know Renekton's skills shove up the lane because of the way Renekton works. His Q shoves the lane, his E shoves the lane. And that's where the enemy is going to look to kind of camp, because if you're a Renekton, you're overextended. It's very hard to gank you, yes, but it's also possible to gank you, and most likely the enemy is going to be crying like, I need a gank on this Renekton, he's at my turret, etc, etc. So, and you also have to look at, if you want to take an example from the previous screenshot, Ziggs versus Viger. Viger I'm pretty sure this game, he was at his turret 99% of the time. So Ziggs was not going to ever get a gank from Vi unless it was a counter gank, and Ziggs would have the proper wards to know that the counter gank is coming. But because we had a Rammus can gank from a very long distance, and he just comes in and zooms through, and he ended up blocking Ziggs long enough that the Viger got an early lead, and Ziggs would have to play at his turret. So that's how lane matchups work, and there's tons of examples, and honestly just learning lane matchups comes from experience and just playing tons of games, looking at tons of footage. Do our champions have synergy, like Shyvana or Orianna? Many people, that's an obvious synergy, where you look at Orianna, you're just like, alright, I'll ball a Shyvana, or Lulu, I'll wild growth the Shyvana as she goes in. And sometimes you're looking at it and you're like, alright, cool. Or sometimes what very happens in solo queue, because it's solo queue, you pick champions like Gragas Fiddle, so the Fiddle 6 goes to ultimate and Gragas panics and he just ultimates everyone away from the Fiddle 6, and then you have people fighting and all that stuff. But a synergy that people don't see would be something like Gragas Fiddlesticks, where you can ultimate people as Gragas into the Fiddlesticks ultimate. So when people try to flash away, that's a synergy that people don't see, and that's a little more hard to come by. And also, if Fiddle fears someone, Gragas can eat into them and slow them, and it's just chain CC. So sometimes when champions obviously look like they don't work together, you can still make them work out. Fourth of all is, do we have the CC to create these picks? Like if you're running a Twitch, Ahri, Nocturne team comp, that's a pick comp through and through. What you need to do is you need to shove you need to clear waves as Ahri, get deep wards, and then as Twitch you go in stealth, and then Ahri charms someone, Nocturne jumps on the person, you get the pick, and then now it's a 4v5 and you're lacking ultimates, but that's okay because you can take things like dragons, you can take things like turrets now and stuff like that. You can force it because it's a 4v5, even though Twitch is a poor sieger, and Ahri has her charm, which is a huge catch potential when people are trying to defend their turrets. And Nocturne can also split push and stuff like that. And then fifth of all is, what type of team comp do we have? This needs to be into consideration. You cannot force objectives if you're a poke comp. What you need to do, or you cannot force dragon, I should say, dragons and barons if you're a poke comp. Because what you need to do is you need to let the enemy team start that first and then make the call to poke them out when they're doing it, and then you can take the objective yourself, or you can go and force kills. If you're a siege composition, you need to group middle, you need to start poking out the enemy team, and you need to let your Caitlyn or your Jinx and start hitting the turret. And then if you're a split push competition, you need to let Xerath, you need to let Corki, you need to let whoever else just clear waves middle while your Nidalee split pushes or your Ryze split pushes and stuff like that. If you press R to win, just let the enemy team do an objective while you go in with your Fiddlesticks ultimate, with your Orianna ultimates and your Gallia ultimates, and then bam, you kill them all in a clusterfuck of 5v5 AoE, and they end up dying, and you take the objective, and the enemy team just can't team fight you. And also it comes down to, like, if you're a 5v5 or a press R comp to win, that determines when you're going to fight. Do not fight without your ultimates up. You need to consider that. Like, if someone says, oh, fight, 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 but you look, or you want to fight as a shot caller, but you look and you see all the ultimates are down, do not make that call to fight. Like, that's just simple analyzing your team comp and your strengths and your weaknesses, and just going over the reset comp. Do you have the reset comp? Like, are people going to get low enough that you can actually get the resets on things like Katarina, Master Yi, Kha'Zix, or Tristana to continue the resets? Fourth of all, are we an early, mid-game, or late-game team comp? That should affect your shot calling greatly, because usually the roles that I prescribed for shot calling, like a jungler, really affects the early game. And if your team comp is not an early game team comp, what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to try to make sure you guys don't fall behind so far. That should be your goal as an early game team composition. If you're a mid game team comp, your goal should be to get as much as you can out of the early game, and to get those power spikes like Trinity Forces or Blade of the Ruined Kings, and to force fights in the mid game, or to just straight up shove into the enemy turret. That should be your goal. And your last, as a late game team composition, should be to just try to survive, and then wait till your Vayne gets big, or wait till your Ryze gets big and they stack the Rod of Ages and the tiers and stuff like that. So as the next point is the best place to allocate jungle pressure. As a jungler, or even just pressure from roaming, if you're a Zed and you completely rock your lane and you're 3-0, and the easiest thing to do is just to back and buy items, but the best thing to do after you rock your lane would be to call your jungler, get deep wards in the enemy's bot side jungle, and then to dive the bot lane, because now not only are you using your lead to kind of poop on your lane, but you're using it to take care of the enemy's bot lane. And when you're trying to exert your lead, what you can do, and when you're also shot calling, you do not make the shot call to take dragon if the mid lane kills the enemy mid laner, because you're completely forgetting the jungler, A, and B, the bot lane. Is your bot lane getting wrecked themselves? It becomes now of a choice like, oh, we can't take this dragon because our bot lane's getting rocked, or the enemy jungler is ahead of me. Whereas you should look to, as a Zed, dive the bot lane, because not only does it put you ahead because you get some assist gold, but it puts your bot lane ahead, and now you can take the dragon because A, the mid lane's behind, B, the bot lane is non-existent because they're dead. So, and your bot lane's ahead, so that's a free dragon. So instead of it being a 3v4, it's now a 2v4, even a 1v4, and now it's up to the enemy jungler to try and steal that. So jungle pressure, also, like, if you're a Renekton, do not call your jungle up to just sit in your lane because the enemy jungler is there. You're a Renekton, you should be able to escape ganks. What you should call your jungler up for is to dive and to exert your early pressure and stuff like that. Like, you should call your jungler up to dive the Riven who's low HP under her turret. You should call your jungler up for a counter gank if you know that that you can come out in the 2v2. You should not call your jungler up if you're Ryze and you just want to make sure to get your tier. I mean, it's okay if you're in a duo, but like, you're just taking something away from the rest of the map that could be used to get a dragon bot lane or a turret bot lane or a turret middle, or get some picks or deep wards in the enemy jungle for onto their buffs. Like, it's super selfish to if you're the shot caller, to call the jungler into the lane to just babysit you and hold your dick to try and get items. And lastly, just get outdrafted by picking things like Nami, Ashe, and Xerath into Yasuo, Braum, and Morg. Like, these guys cancel your CC and have walls to block skill shots, so that's what it is, and that should be pretty obvious. And also, like, if you're something like an AoE team composition with Fiddlesticks and Rammus and Viger, and the enemy team picks Irelia. Irelia's just going to skirt around through your CC by stacking Merc Treads and getting her passive and also the mastery in the tree. So now we go to level 1s. This I felt like was next in the flowchart from team compositions, and just getting into it, do we have our buffs warded, choke points, and high traffic areas warded? So when you look at the information, it's just about, shot calling is about taking information and making the best decision based on that information. So when you look at the map and you look at around 130, because that's when trinket wards are going down, did people actually use their wards, or did you see the enemy ward things like the little bush going into their buffs? Did they ward choke points? Did they actually ward their buffs? Did they ward the areas where people are going to be crossing, like mid lane? So that's what you have to take into consideration if you think the enemy has it warded. If you don't, that's a risk that you're going to have to take. And shot calling is also about risk reward. Like, this might be a low risk, but it comes out with a low reward, or this might be high risk and comes out with a high reward. Sometimes you're going to have things like high risk and low reward, like if the enemy actually warded every single thing coming into their blue buff and you decide to invade the blue buff and they have an Annie and a Karma, and you just take massive amounts of AoE damage, that was low risk because the reward was taking either a first blood or the enemy's buff, and the downsides to that was getting aced at level 1 because you called your team to group up. That was a bad call, and you should take that into consideration for the next time you're presented with the same information. Third, we have strong level 1 champions like Janna, Annie, Karma, Blizzard, Thresh. That's an obvious, like, you don't want to a level 1 fight if the enemy team has an Annie or Karma, but you do want a level 1 fight if your team has a Blitz or Thresh, because you can get a hook onto the enemy team. And something like Janna is decent at level 1 and she's also an X factor, which I touch into, because Janna can potentially go shield and save someone, or she can go tornado and just get a 5-man knockup, which also saves some people in certain situations. And then next is the X factors that certain champions bring, which are people like Shen, Viger, and Ahri. Does the Ahri actually get charm at level 1, or does she get her Q to poke you out to prevent you from doing level 1 in the first place? Does the Viger get Q because he knows he wants to farm, or does the Viger get the stun for the 5-man stun and lets his team take care of it? Does the Shen get taunt and flash taunts you, or does the Shen get Q so that he survives the lane phase? So, like, these X factors you have to take into consideration. It becomes a risk. Does the Viger actually take his stun and stuff like that? Second to last point is, do we late invade, or do we just rush in hoping that the enemy team is AFK under their turrets, surfing Reddit, alt tabs, looking at YouTube videos, whatever? Maybe they're just waiting for the minions to spawn. That is something super important. Like, do you just rush in solo queue? I would actually advocate just rushing in and trying to find the enemy team, killing them all, or trying to get a lucky pick, because people most often are alt tabs sitting at their buffs or sitting at their turret and not even warding and stuff like that. Like, this doesn't happen, and you won't find people who ward until you start getting into like high platinum, and that's still very rare in itself. And even diamond elo, I still see people just AFKing under the turret, and you could even do it things like Challenger, when you see the streamers like they AFK under the turret, they play Spelunky and Q and stuff like that, or they're playing Spelunky or Hearthstone coming into the beginning of the game, and their team gets ace level 1 because it was a 4v5 and they weren't there, and the best they can say is oops, sorry. So like, it's a risk versus reward, and you have to take the risk and reward. In ranked 5s, I would argue if you're in the lower bracket of ranked 5s, like, don't bother with it. If you're a Challenger, if you're Diamond, like, yeah, level 1's really important, and you kind of don't want to rush into the enemy team unless you're super confident in your level 1 and you have something like the Thresh and the Annie. And lastly, is it worth it to burn summoners for a kill or an escape? As a shot caller, you should be the one to call flash, 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 or for the kill, or flash, flash, flash into escape. Because if you're an early game team composition, if you flash for a kill, that is so worth it because you get the extra level 1 gold from First Blood, and you get the assist, and you get the potions and everything, and you burn the enemy summoners, so now you can exert your early game pressure. If you're a late game team composition, the one thing you want to do is not give up that early game lead because it makes your game that much harder. So that's it for level 1s. Early game, so which lanes are going to shove, which lanes are going to dominate early. So if you have something like a Renekton and you have something like a Ryze mid lane, you know Ryze is going to be sitting under his turret, you know Renekton is going to be pushing, so the enemy is going to most likely look towards camping the top lane because you have that Renekton shoving in early. So if you're the jungler, you want to either be top lane to counter gank, or you want to be mid lane to trying to help the Ryze get out of the rut that he's in because he is Ryze. Or you want to just go bot lane and try to snowball your bot lane, because I think that's where the most volatility is, and it's really, really crucial to help bot lane, because it's not one person, it's two person. If you help the bot lane, you can potentially help your support get deep wards, and you can help your AD carry get fed, which is arguably where a lot of the gold should go to. Second of all, this is for all lanes, but it's also for the support, and it's also for the jungle, it's also for the mid lane, to know where the jungler will end up after his initial jungle rotation. Do you have to ward at 3 minutes because the jungler is on his bot side or his top side? As a mid lane, you're going to have to ward regardless. As a bot lane, you're not going to have to ward sometimes. As a top lane, you're not going to have to ward sometimes. As a jungler, you should try to find the enemy jungler. You should try to help your team. You should ping it out. If you're a jungler and you know that the Lee Sin just invaded your red buff, and you know where he is, he's on the top side of the map, ping it for your top lane and your mid lane so that they should watch out. If you're a support and you're not really doing much, it's just a passive lane, you're Soraka, you're Johnny, you're just healing your AD carry, then ping out where the enemy jungler might be for your AD carry and for your team. So it's just knowing where the enemy jungler is. Third of all, I touched on this before. Should I call my enemy? Should I call the jungler to help me, or should I pressure? Or should he pressure other lanes and objectives? As for a Renekton, you're going to be drawing lots of pressure top lane. As a Riven, you're going to be drawing lots of pressure top lane because of the potential to kill the enemy team, or to kill the enemy, and potential for 2v2. What I like to do is, as a top laner, I like to draw a lot of pressure. I like to pick early game. I like to, instead of farming under the turret, I like to get huge, and I like to just constantly battle the enemy team. I like to get wards close to me and wards deep in the enemy jungle, and I like to tool with the enemy jungler. And it's like playing with fire. It's just like risk and reward. You have to tell your team the enemy jungler is up here, get objectives, or go invade the enemy jungle. And as a jungler, you should also recognize that, and that's just part of playing well. But it's important to be in communication with your team and to tell them these things, because sometimes as a jungler, you're not going to be looking at that, and you're going to be zoned out because you're killing the creep farm, or you're planning out your next steps, and you're planning out item builds and stuff like that. Next is, does the enemy jungler even gank pre-level 6, or are they something like a Warwick, Nocturne, and sometimes Vi or Malphite, where they're going to wait until level 6 to get ganks off? So that means you can be aggressive early game, or that you have no worries that the enemy jungler is going to gank you, so that you can skip out on a ward to get the extra potion or to get the extra item. And it also affects shot calling, because now you know that the enemy jungler is going to be weak pre-6. And also, are they waiting on an item power spike? So things like Feral Flare junglers, like sometimes Xin Xiao and usually Master Yi. So if you invade the enemy jungle, or if you know that if it comes to a 3v3 fight, you can take this fight because you're stronger than the enemy, because they don't have their Feral Flare, or they're still trying to stack it. So that's things like that. Is keeping up the enemy's turret worth the denier? Do I take it to snowball my team and get map pressure? As a Renekton, if you completely pooped on a Ryze lane, and I also touched on this with Corky and I when we pooped on Kog'Maw, Do you keep the turret up, or do you take the turret for global gold for your team, and do you group with your team, or do you constantly push in and make sure the enemy can't freeze? That's all up to play styles, and you can't really notice that in solo queue, but what I like to do is just take the turret because you're already ahead, and to put pressure. And yes, the enemy has the potential to either just split push and start getting solo farm, or to freeze the lane and catch back up. But you should be able to turn your early lead into ganks and to jungle pressure for your team. And last of all is, I lost my lane. What is my role now going into mid game? So you're losing lane as Renekton. What is your role? Your role now becomes to just get the stun onto the AD carrier, get the stun onto whoever's jumping onto your AD carry, usually the fed top laner that you fed, and to build tanky. If you're losing as Renekton top lane, you shouldn't be getting the Hydra, and it should also go into your shot calling. If you're a Lee Sin and you notice that your Renekton's losing, tell your Renekton, alright, build tanky, dude. You're going to be helping to peel, but if you're ahead as Lee Sin in the jungle, your job isn't to peel. Your job is to now dive onto the enemy's backline and try to see if you could get the insect kick onto the enemy's AD carry into your team. Or if your job is still to peel, use the kick to prevent the fed top laner from coming in onto your AD carry. That should affect your shot calling, because not every game are you going to have a top laner who goes 10-0, and not every game are you going to have a top laner who goes 0-10. Most games you're going to have a top laner who goes even, and they build appropriately for the situation. And yeah, just if your team is ahead, that should affect your shot calling. If your team's behind, that should affect your shot calling going into mid game. Mid game, how the lanes go, and also you're going to notice as this PowerPoint goes on, there's less and less actually on, because early game is the easiest, where you can have a checklist of do this, this, and this because of X, Y, and Z. And usually when people go into late game and mid game, there's so many different variables that comes into factors in consideration into shot calling, that it becomes just a video on, or not a video, but it comes down to experience, which is what I want to say. And the easiest way to detonate experience is to just look at the games played, and to also look at your elo. Sorry, I had to take a drink. So this kinds of ties in the first point, or the last point I had in the early game. How did the lanes go in, and did the jungle turn out after the early game? So it's just taking into consideration early game and how did it turn out. What is your comp good at, and where do we give solo lane farm to? This is super, super important, because in competitive games, in ranked 5s, in solo queue, there's a mid-game lull, where after the early game, things just don't happen, because people are waiting for the next dragon, people are waiting for people to get certain item power spikes, people are waiting on wards. This is the time where you collect yourself, and you tell your team, okay, early game might have not gone as well, or early game might have gone super well, this is what we need to do. If your team is a siege composition, you guys got to group mid with your Caitlyn and with your Janna and with your Jinx and Nunu, and just start forcing down turrets. If your team's a poke composition, look to go with your Varus, with your Corki, with your Kog'Maw, and just look to poke out the enemy team with your Ziggs, poke out the enemy team and take objectives. If your team is an AoE team comp, look out to force objectives and let the enemy take objectives, or to get wards and clear vision so that your Fiddlesticks gets a good ultimate, or that Shyvana gets a good flank, and that your Orianna can ball the Shyvana and get a nice ultimate off. So that's things that you have to take into consideration in solo farm. Usually what happens is people have poor wave control, so the waves are pushing into different turrets, and sometimes you're going to have to give up objectives if people really want to get farm, because if you have a Vayne or Rise, they need to scale up into that late game. So you need to give them the farm to get the power spikes that they need. So you're going to have to give up something like turrets. Third of all, do we have the proper warding, team comps, or numbers to force objectives? Sometimes you're not going to have the best pink wards, and the enemy team is going to have things warded, and you're just going to have to force the dragon anyways, because it's what you need to come back into the game. This is your win condition. You need gold to stay even with the enemy team, or you need this gold to snowball your lead as an early game team composition. And because you were early game and you were dominant in the early game, the enemy team cannot contest this no matter what. And the only way the enemy team can contest this is if they're a poke composition, and or if they're an AoE composition, they get lucky AoEs. So those are things you're going to have to take into consideration. Fifth of all, I touched into it or actually fourth of all, I touched into this win conditions. How do we get back into this game, or how do we close this game? So if you're an early game team, win condition is just push mid, or force objectives, or force picks into the enemy's jungle, and to dive the enemy team. Because you're early game, you were tanky enough from the early game, you're transitioning into mid game, you are just trying to force fights right now. If you're a split push team comp and your split pusher is actually behind, what you want to do is you want to ward up your top side jungle or your bottom side jungle where your split pusher, whichever lane your split pusher is going to go in, and you want to just help that split pusher as much as possible, gank whoever is going to defend that split pusher, and go back middle and let your split pusher catch back up. And then your split pusher eventually becomes such a huge threat that the enemy team is going to have to send multiple people, but it's already warded because you were helping your split pusher. So that's the calls you're going to have to do. And lastly, kind of towards the end of mid game, and sometimes even during mid game, because of certain cheese champions like Nunu, Mundo, Warwick, Jax, Udyr, Master Yi, and like a Fed Vi or something like that, who can cheese or sneak Baron. I don't like to call it cheese because I think it's a valid strategy that you clear out wards, and it's just keep in the back of your mind, is Baron a threat that the enemy can sneak, or do we need it to close out the game as an early team composition? Just tell your team, group up Baron. There's no way the enemy can actually group up Baron, deny vision, and then wait in the jungle. Wait for the enemy to come in, we kill him, the death timer is like 20-30 seconds, we can burn this Baron fast enough that we can take it and close out the game because it's like an extra item. So that's just mid game. Late game, is our team comp equipped for this stage of the game? If you were an early game team comp and the enemy managed to drag it out, you're most likely not winning this game unless you get a lucky pick, or unless you get a lucky fight, because they do have this Vayne, they do have this Kog'Maw, they do have this Tristana, who's been skilling throughout the game and is going to do massive amounts of damage. And that's something you're going to have to take into consideration when shot calling. Like, what are we going to do to get back into this game? We need to get wards here, we need to get wards here, we need to get wards here, we need to sweep this, and we need to force a pick, because we know this Vayne is going to try to get this red buff, we know this Vayne is going to try to get solo farm, because she needs to be huge to carry the enemy team on their back. And this is, second of all, kind of tying into the first, are we losing our lead or gaining one? So is our team comp scaling better into the late game, or is our team comp losing its edge? And it's solo queue, anything can happen in rank 5s. Usually anything doesn't happen, but miracles do happen in ranked 5s. And as you get higher into the elo brackets and higher into the levels of competitive play, less and less does actual like luck factor into these things, and more are people playing perfectly so that they know we need to get wards here, I can't overextend, come 40 minutes I can't be farming race and stuff like that. So, and also if come late game, it's always good to remind your team, don't farm Wraiths, guys. Like, or if your team's gonna be farming Wraiths, go with them. Like, say, all right, ping the Wraiths or whatever. Tell everyone to come. If you have that unresponsive guy who's like, no, I want to farm Wraiths anyways, just bring your whole team to him, because the worst thing that happens is the guy gets picked off. You're at a 4v5, the enemy team dives you, and you lost it because you were 4v5 in the skill later. The best thing that happens is there's multiple people when the guy gets picked off at race, and you guys fight a 5v5 there, and you end up winning that 5v5, and you get shoved middle or shoved top or bottom or whatever, or you take Baron and you can close out the game. And lastly, it's just, what is our team comp good at now, and how can we close out the game? Do you need Baron to close out the game? Most likely for teams in solo queue, yes, you do need Baron to close out the game once you're at like platinum or above, because people understand that Baron is such a huge objective. And by when I say need Baron, I mean like you can bait Baron. Baron's something that you can use to help you to force a fight. People will usually give up Baron at platinum and like and above, and like they'll just either send one person to try and steal it, and then you'll get that 5-man pick onto the person. The person does the miracle steal, and now the game is stalled out longer. And if you're something like a Nidalee split push team comp, you don't need Baron to close out the game. You can let the enemy team have Baron, because guess what? Your Nidalee is taking bottom inhibitor, and now the enemy team, if they were to get Baron, they would lose their inhib, and you have a poke comp while the Nidalee is split pushing, so you're poking with Xerath and Kog'Maw and Ziggs, and then they're losing out on their HP. So if they were to fight, they were to be super low, or you can poke them out when to stop the ports, as Trick would say. So now the enemy team can't defend against the Nidalee or the Master Yi split pushing, and they just lose their Nexus, and you win the game like that. So that's all things you have to take into consideration. And lastly, objective control and closing words. I put objective control over here because it goes into all levels of play, whether it's early game, mid game, late game, and are you controlling things. And objectives are buffs, turrets, dragon, baron. So those are objectives. And also I like to think of pink wards as kind of mini objectives, how you defend pink wards and how you place pink wards. So this I think is mostly kind of just repeating myself, but you can read this, you could pause the video if you like, but I don't think I need to go over this. And if you're already this far into the video, I applaud you. And just closing words, I would like to go back and just remind you of how you can't win every game. Shot calling is something that you have to practice at, just like the same way people practice at mechanics on a Riven or Lee Sin, and even on your champions. And yes, it's discouraging when you go into solo queue and no one listens to your calls, but it's also super encouraging when people at the end of the game you get the honors for teamwork, the honors for friendly, the honors for leadership, and honors for helpful and all that stuff, and you're just like, oh wow, really cool. I led my team to victory. And also it's really good to be the person like, dude, in rank 5s when people are like, dude, we couldn't have done this without you, or thanks for putting the team on your back in a way that's not super visible. And it's also really good to get this practice, because if you're a support player, or if you're a jungle player, if you're a mid lane player, and you're looking to get into a top team, or your dream is eventually to go pro, to be a shot caller, this is a quality that it's very hard to train into solo queue unless you try to instill it into players when they're at the lower elos, or when they're trying to climb the ladder. Because once people get into challenger, people get into high elos, or into the competitive teams, it's very hard for someone to go from very play focused, like they're focusing just purely on mechanics, to into changing their mind to now it's about the team, and now I have to take in all this information, and now I have 70% of the picture. Do I make this call for the team? So that's it. And if this video was good enough, maybe I'll go more in depth into certain things. I'll just make a really long video on just objective control. Maybe I'll just make a really long video on early games, and I'll present different scenarios, and maybe I'll commentate on certain games. Who knows? Maybe I do that, maybe I don't. I'll probably eventually do something like that if this video is good enough, or this video gets enough views. But anyways, I'm going to sign off, and thanks for watching. And I'll probably link certain parts if people want to get better at certain things, but this was just a general video and to get people started into shot calling. So thanks for watching, and I would like to see more of it in solo queue, and also hear more about people being definite shot callers in their challenger or competitive pro teams.